So in the early kind of spring, late winter, early spring, we decided at NPSIA to engage in some conversations with some stakeholders about Canada's development and humanitarian agenda and the way that Canada engages in fragile settings. And we were really motivated, I guess, by a couple of things. One, what people have been talking about all day, the kind of the President Trump phenomenon, the dismantling of US aid, et cetera. But in our view, that was really a manifestation of existing trends rather than something that came out of the blue. There's been an assault, I think, on development and humanitarian assistance for a while. We wanted to kind of make the case for how and why Canadian engagement in these settings is important. And we wanted, to focus on the why, but we also wanted to focus a little bit on the how. And so in terms of what we found or what we proposed, it was a very quick exercise because we wanted to get it out just after the elections. It was launched in May at an event at the Aga Khan. So we suggested kind of two things. The first was that the G7 focus on development and engagement and fragility and talk about some of the challenges that we've been talking about today. That didn't happen, and that was a bit of a disappointment. If you look at the G7 agenda that came out of Kananaskis, it was really devoid of a lot of discussion on development in a way that was incredibly disappointing. And I think the argument that we needed to keep President Trump happy by not talking about that was really a missed opportunity, because I think we could have made President Trump happy by talking about that. The second thing that we suggested was that Canada really engage, this new government really engage in the development of a framework for Canada's development and humanitarian work, recognizing that the FIAP probably was going to be phased out. So we looked at some principles, we looked at some goals, some mechanisms, some priorities, and some signature initiatives. I thought it might be just helpful. You can find it on our website, but just to kind of highlight a couple of things that haven't emerged during the discussion today. So one of the things that we talked about a lot was the need for a clear vision, but that we really should not talk about Canadian values, that we should be talking about universal values. And this idea, you'll hear Prime Minister Carney and other members of the government talk about, Canadian values to which others aspire. That is really weird to me. I don't understand that connotation. So we really wanted to focus on the universalism of some of these principles. We wanted to really emphasize civilian protection. This isn't something that we've talked a lot about today. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is a rapid erosion of kind of fundamental principles of the protection of civilians in conflict, international humanitarian law. And we're seeing this most obviously, I guess, in Gaza, but it's happening in other conflicts around the world. The other thing that we talked about was an ecosystem for development. So we've had really great conversations here about financing, about artificial intelligence. We really wanted the government to think about how they could ensure that there's in the places that they're trying to do financing for development or AI or, target countries for the SDGs, think about it as an ecosystem and how all of these things could work together and have kind of a Team Canada approach. And we talked a little bit about a bureaucracy, the need for a bureaucracy to get it done, and the importance of good diplomacy. I heard kind of maybe a dismissal of diplomacy in the previous panel. Having worked closely with Canadian diplomats, I think that we need to invest more in Canadian diplomacy. And the final thing that I'll say, and then I'll pass it back to you, is just the really critical importance of government engaging with researchers. So one of the things that I think is striking to me in Ottawa versus other places that I've kind of worked in, London, Stockholm, Oslo, is that we don't, there isn't a lot of back and forth between the research community and policymakers. It's not the same kind of ecosystem that you see in other settings, and so we really recommended that be something that the government really engage in is funding research on development and humanitarian and peace building issues, but also engaging in discussions and ensuring that there's that red team or that challenge function that academia can provide in ways that perhaps organizations that are dependent on government funding can't. So let me turn it back to you, Stephen, and ask you how you would kind of characterize kind of the current moment in the development humanitarian space in Canada, and if and how you think, how effectively you think Canada is meeting this moment.
Yeah, really easy question. You've already hinted at some of the elements of the crisis and Trump's reelection and the feeding of USAID into the wood chipper, sort of like they precipitated the crisis, but the crisis has been brewing for a long time, and several countries have been cutting their foreign aid over the past 2 years. But now we're seeing a constellation of changes that have just pushed the foreign aid system or the development system to the brink and maybe over the edge. I don't really know, but I feel this is very much like one of those critical junctures, like un moment charnière, like a hinge moment, where like this is our chance to do something better, ambitious, big. And, we've been saying this for 6 months and it's not happening. Little things are happening. The AU has been organizing some African stuff, regional specific stuff, which might be great, might not be, I don't really know, but there's a lot of potential there. Mm-hmm. But the UN is about to celebrate its 80th anniversary or is currently. And the UN at 80 is not a celebration. The UN at 80 is a cost-cutting exercise. It's reducing its staff. It's talking about perhaps merging agencies. It might even abolish UN AIDS. So the whole system is in a huge crisis that has been brewing, but it's really come to this point. And now is the time to have the discussions on what can replace it. And as far as I know, it's not really happening. And that's something that's worrying because it means we're just limping along as more and more countries cut aid, where it becomes more and more thinkable to cut aid radically. But to be clear, Trump was not the first. The UK recently cut their foreign aid by 40% on top of a large cut before that. So they had achieved and had legislated the 0.7% of GNP or target and had met it for several years. Then they temporarily reduced it to 0.5, and then they further reduced it to 0.3. So they've cut foreign aid by more than 50%. Canada had promised to increase foreign aid every year until 2030. This promise had been repeated many times. It had been broken, but you could excuse it in some way if you're going to be charitable by saying, well, okay, the spending around COVID was more than expected. So when that went down, it went back to the regular line of gradual increases. But that's a very charitable read, and the signals we're hearing about what's going to come up in the next budget do not support this idea that it's going to keep increasing even in small amounts, and quite to the opposite. So this is a terrible time. Horrible things are happening all over the world because of these budget cuts. And I'm the first to criticize foreign aid and donors, but the fact that so many horrible things are happening, that children are being stunted or dying, or people are now seroconverting, becoming HIV positive because of mother-to-child transmission, or they're not getting the ARVs that they need. This is a sign that foreign aid was actually doing a lot of good. So the alarm bells have been ringing, but the focus that I'm seeing a lot of is on, okay, how do we cut costs? And of course, there are things to cut costs on, but this kind of radical way is not the way to go about it. Yeah, I guess that's already maybe too long an answer.
No, I don't think it's too long at all. And if I could pick, I know I'm going off script and we're only 5 minutes.
So go ahead.
But one of the things that you raised, you were talking about how there doesn't seem to be much happening here, and I would agree. But one of the places that I think that it is happening is global health. So there's been a lot of doom and gloom today, and there is definitely doom and gloom in global health because the U.S. was one of the biggest donors. But I think one of the great things about the way that health investment has happened in some places, and it's not everywhere, is that even though there are lots of problems, and I've been critical, we have seen national capacity be built in really tremendous ways. And I think that you're seeing some national leaders really start to take ownership of the need to be in the driver's seat of decision making. Hopefully that will translate into a push domestically to increase the share of GDP to health within domestic budgets, because that's critically important in order to make up the difference in terms of the drop in financing. But I think that there are hopeful signs of things happening in certain places driven by communities themselves. And I think that we can take inspiration from that.
So let me ask you, since you are someone who works in public health and peace and development and humanitarian action, if we step back from the issue of what is happening, can we talk a little bit about what we have been doing and what Canada, not just what we could do, but what Canada has been doing concretely over the past 10 years or so? Specifically FIAP. I mean, you mentioned FIAP very, very briefly, the Feminist International Assistance Policy. I don't think any of the previous speakers brought it up. I don't think the word feminist was mentioned even once, which shows how quickly things change in Ottawa, even though, there was a finger pointed here. Maybe you mentioned it? Yeah. Okay, I missed that, sorry. Okay. So hardly mentioned at all. We didn't even have a change of government. I mean, the Liberals are still in power. FIAP is still officially our policy, yet no one talks about it. We had a really interesting panel here a few weeks ago, just down the hall, on FIAP and doing sort of an assessment. And we spent, I don't know, an hour and a half or 2 hours talking about it. But let me throw this to you, Val, as someone who works on these areas and who knows a lot about what Canada has been doing. What's your assessment of FIAP and what it's achieved since it was adopted in 2017?
I think I wrote down a comment from Danny Roderick, who said, "Who put capital in the driver's seat of development?" And I thought that was a really important quote. And I think that when we're looking at gender equality and the FIAP, there's a lot of great things that came out of that. So some of the research that I've done We just did a Lancet commission a couple of years ago on the relationship between improved gender equality and health equity and more peaceful societies. It's clear that gender equity is essential. It's an essential component of development. It's an essential component of humanitarian engagement. And I'm very pleased that Canada, it doesn't seem to be backing away from a commitment to gender equality that was mentioned by Minister Anand during her UN speech. I think that the FIAP really strengthened gender equality architecture, I would call it, within Global Affairs Canada. And I think the other thing that it did, which was super critical, was really hold the line on sexual and reproductive health and rights. So within women's health more generally, and you're thinking about empirically driven interventions, there isn't a better intervention that brings a better bang for your buck than investing in sexual and reproductive health and rights. It has incredible impacts in terms of education attainment, labor productivity, basically from a rights perspective, the capabilities framework, the ability to engage and choose when you want to have a family and with whom. So it covers a lot of ground, and I'm really grateful for Canada for holding the line on that. I do think that the FIAP got some things wrong. I think that sometimes the focus was on kind of the solution without always fully diagnosing the problem within a particular setting. I think that it was a development policy on a pedestal. I think that gender equality is a pillar, but it kind of was the only game in town. It seems to be in the development policy, and that limited the flexibility, I think, on the ground to be able to be responsive to other things. I think that it didn't generate sufficient buy-in. I think that that sometimes, and I felt sometimes that when I was on panels on kind of feminist international assistance policy and was a bit critical, I was voted off the island. So I think there's a little bit of a tribal mentality there, and I think you need to be able to respond to your critics, including the Auditor General. I think that wasn't the response that, oh, you're not just gender equality is hard to measure, isn't really a good response. I think we owe it to Canadian taxpayers to be more, accountable than that. So yeah, I think that there's some great things about the FIAP, but some challenges that I hope can be tweaked, and that I hope that gender equality architecture will remain as we move
I have a follow-up question.
Okay, so I'll pause my question. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so you keep talking about gender equality, but one of the criticisms of FIAP is that it's not so much about gender equality, it's about women's empowerment or women and girls. That it's so focused on women and helping women. So that, the Harper government talked about saving women. The FIAP talks about empowering women, but it's still the old women in development approach and not so much innovative thinking about gender equality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I would agree that it was focused on women and girls, and even the kind of the posters that came out with the FIAP was all about empowering women and girls will change the world. I think that it missed, because of that focus, it missed other things like LGBTQ, but I would also suggest that it missed some issues with men as well, men and boys, in some places that is really challenging. I was involved in helping an organization on a COVID project, and I was supposed to be the gender advisor. And when you looked at kind of the vulnerability or taking a gender lens, you have to address the things that make different communities vulnerable in that moment. And there were things that, women had a higher risk of, but there were also issues associated with, particularly gender minorities in some settings and testing. But there was, for men, um, men biologically were more susceptible to COVID. And actually, in many places, the mortality rate was much higher. And they were much less willing to be vaccinated and to change their behavior. And so, with that, when we talk about gender and gender equality, we absolutely need to have that more kind of nuanced kind of perspective. So I wondered, you've shared a little bit about your impressions of FIAP. Where do you think that we should go now? How do you think that we should transition? And where do you think we should transition to?
So clarification, please. Transition from, you mean from FIAP or? Sorry,
Yes,
what's the question?
The question is, we've talked a lot about the challenges of our time, and we talked a bit about FIAP, and I wondered, if you had some other impressions that you'd like to share on the FIAP, but also where you think Canadian priorities will shift and where they should shift.
Okay, so time is limited, and like I said, we had a whole panel just on FIAP, and FIAP is kind of dead, so let's not. Yes. So we don't want it to be dead. I mean, that was sort of the final message of that panel was we can criticize FIAP to death, but we'll really miss it when it's gone. One thing I would add is a very limited view of what women's empowerment is. And Laura Parisi has written a really good article about this. She's at the University of Victoria. It's a very neoliberal feminism, and it's about empowering women is about women starting their own businesses. And that's kind of it. And another thing that really surprised me about FIAP, but then didn't at all, was the continuity with the role of the private sector and innovative financing and so on. You've heard Susan and Senator Galvez talk about that. The fact that we transitioned to all this stuff, from women and girls gender equality and we're going to do all this stuff with the private sector, and then this assumption that helping blended finance will translate into pro-poor and pro-women growth. And when we look at the private sector, they are not the leaders in gender equality. I mean, look at corporate boardrooms in Canada, look at Silicon Valley. These are very male-dominated. What sector has advanced women's careers and gender equality? The public sector. So this idea that somehow magically the private sector was going to help women seemed like magical thinking to me. And the previous panel also talked a little bit about how it tends to go to middle income countries. And so this idea that it would be pro-poor. If the private sector needs to make a profit, I'm not sure how going into a low income neighborhood or very low income neighborhood, how the private sector is going to make money off of a school or a clinic, and they shouldn't. You should not be making money off of a school or a clinic in an environment where they need those services. So those were some of the other concerns, but I'm looking at the time. We have so much we want to talk about and not so much time. So let's talk about what to expect from the Carney government. Does that sound good?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay, so I'll start it off. I've been asking around. There's always a lot of secret around budgets, obviously. People are talking about a 15% cut at GAC. When I press for details, it's like, okay, is it the overall budget or the aid budget, the ODA budget? And sometimes I get, oh, I don't know. And sometimes it's both. You're mouthing both. Okay. People have also said, and this was in the Liberal platform, that humanitarian assistance would not be cut. which means that the development side will get a cut of more than 15%. We'll see. But from a government that did not campaign on cutting budgets, from a government that talked about the importance of defending Canada's action in this area, and an international context where aid is needed more than ever, because the US foreign aid has been destroyed. As I mentioned, the UK has cut radically, Germany has cut radically, France. I mean, this is the first time ever that all the largest donors in the world have cut their foreign aid budgets radically. So if Canada wants to distinguish itself from other countries and really show itself as standing up for interests of the global South, this is the time and the way to do it. Now, I didn't watch Anita Anand's speech at the UN, but you've mentioned it. So could you talk about what kind of signaling you were getting out of that and what your sense is around priorities?
Yeah, so I think that both Minister Anand and Prime Minister Carney, when they spoke at in New York, so Minister Anand was the one at the UN, talked about kind of three priorities for our foreign policy. The first was security and defense. The second was economic resilience, and they meant for us, not for the world. And the third was values. And Minister Anand mentioned gender equality, she mentioned democracy, et cetera. So I think, what we're going to see is my anticipation is that the focus will be on budgetary focus will be on increased defense spending. We've made those promises, seemingly without public consultation, upwards of 5%, which is incredible to me, that there would be those promises without a public outcry, basically saying, what are we giving up for this? Definitely, we need to ensure that our military is supported and that we're able to fulfill our obligations internationally. But we also need to be quite critical, I think, about the way that Canada has spent its money in procurement previously and how wisely it's done so. They criticize development actors, and I think defense, there's a lot of risk there associated with that increased budget spending. I have a real concern about the securitization of foreign policy and the lack of development discourse and development thinkers at the table, the lack of people focused on humanitarian issues. What I see in Ottawa, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to the G78 for having this event, is that there are multiple events on security, on defense, on trade. There was one, I think, here on multilateralism that didn't talk about development at all and about the decline of key multilateral institutions that are essential for development. And I worry, security frameworks are very much us versus them. They're very short term in terms of their duration, and they tend to be kind of closed groups that aren't really open to diverse perspectives. And I think that it's going to be really, really critical moving forward that the development and humanitarian community in Ottawa work hard to make their voices heard, talk about what is being lost. If we cut development spending, make the case for development and humanitarian engagement. That's one of the things that the Moving the Needle report tried to do. It is in our interest to engage in development, and I'm not just talking about ODA. I'm also talking about diplomacy. I think that we elevate our diplomacy globally if we work well in low-income settings. I've lived abroad in a bunch of different places, and if Canada has the ability to move the needle in development and humanitarian spaces far more than they have the ability to move the needle in security and defense. And I think there's an opportunity now for us to seize that moment, but it will require all of us, I think, to work closely together, to work with people that we might not always agree with. I think that's one of the challenges in development, is that there's sometimes this ideological purity test that unless you believe this certain thing, you're not going to be invited to the table. I really think that this is a critically important moment for Canada, obviously, in terms of the threat of the Trump tariffs, et cetera, but more importantly for the world. Like 1 in 10 people are living in extreme poverty. There were statistics that were coming out of UNGA that were talking about the increase in the deaths of children in conflict, 337% increase, right? The number of violent conflicts around the world has gone up. We have a responsibility to engage, not impose. I think that one of the things that we really need to take from a lesson from the past is not to impose solutions, but to really engage in kind of a partnership, a shared learning, and a commitment to humanitarian and development principles that we all can share.
I think that's a really good way to end our discussion. I want to add just actually one thing, though, contradicting myself. Great way to end, but I'm going to add something, which goes against what you're just saying. Not that we shouldn't do that, is that it doesn't seem that that's what's happening. So Ahmed Hussein, who was the Minister of International Development until relatively recently, has proposed a motion in the House of Commons. And he is calling for greater attention to the creation of jobs in Canada with Canadian foreign aid, and suggesting opening a special window within GAC for funding that will promote the involvement of Canadian businesses, and it would mandate reports to Parliament on how many Canadians are benefiting from Canadian foreign aid. This reminds me of Julian Fantino, who was a terrible Minister of International Development under the Harper government, who said Canadians have the right to benefit from Canadian foreign aid. And I was horrified at that statement, and I'm now kind of horrified by our former minister from the Liberals presenting this motion, and I have no idea. If anybody knows what's behind this, please talk to me afterwards. Like, does the Carney government, are they behind this? Do they know what's happening? Do they oppose this? What's going on? But to me, this is a signal about how it's become increasingly normalized when even the Liberal Party is touting, is seeking to use foreign aid to help Canadians and Canadian companies. Now, I'm all in favor of helping Canadians and Canadian companies under many circumstances, but we should not be taking that money from foreign aid. That is not the point of foreign aid. So if we want to support Canadian industries, we can have an industrial strategy. That's all fine with me, but not from the aid budget. Okay.
Particularly when the aid budget is going down.
Yes.
Yes, the pie is shrinking. Yeah.
Yeah, and to me, it's shifting the window for the justification of aid. So we say the world needs more Canada, but then we cut our budget and then want to actually keep that aid at home and are openly saying so. So let's transition to a Q&A with, okay, table, I believe it's been numbered table 1. We'll start with 2 questions here. Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Lisa Moreau. I recently retired 2 months ago from GAC-SIDA. I was preceded with experience at the UN and under De Soto's Institute of Peru, local government in the 80s. But I'm sitting here choking because I'm thinking it's about politics. The Liberals want to stay in power. They're reflecting, in my view, what the average Canadian believes and wants. So I absolutely agree with you that this type of forum and the stakeholders here have to take the call and change the narrative. But I'm wondering, we have to speak to Canadians because it's the Canadians that are a bit driving this, oh, we don't need to help other people, we have to keep money here. I get it from my own family. I've worked in development for 30, 40 years, and I'm like, how can you say that? You're obviously ignorant about the situation, all the statistics you come up with. So I absolutely agree with you. The narrative has to change, but I don't know if speaking to the Liberal Party is going to change it because they want to stay in power. So they're going to give Canadians what they want. And I really think that 30 years ago, you had a Canadian public that was extremely sympathetic to goals and values and making the world better. But I don't know if it's social media, but we seem to have lost that momentum. So I absolutely agree with you. If stakeholders like this can change that narrative, speak to the Canadian public, and then they speak to the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, whoever's in power. But I think we live in a very selfish, greedy world, and people are all about me. So I don't know. That's what I'm getting out of this. And I have to say, I think I have to. I mean, I was a senior development officer, and gender has always been there for Canada. It was there in the 90s. They called it WID, they called it GAD, they called it GID. They, whatever political party came in, somehow Canada always tried to maintain a presence for women in development, agency for women. It's been there. It continues to be there. And I think Anan in her third pillar is trying to hold truth to that. And when we work abroad, they always come to you and say, we're so happy that Canada hasn't let go of it. So maybe within our forum here, we think we're letting go of it, but institutionally, it's still there. And then another thing, the Women's Voice in Leadership was our flagship initiative for FIAP. And the LGBTQ and vulnerable communities are there. But in view of what's happening in the South, diversity, inclusion, it's like there's so much pushback. And when you have the Heritage Foundation driving that, it also drives an opportunity for people who have that mindset to change the vocabulary at the Commission on the Status of Women. All the advances that have been made the last 50 years, there's pushback to try and change the jargon back to where it was in the 1950s or 60s. So, in view of that, maybe Canada has quieted its voice on the vocabulary, but I think the values of what Canada wants us to have are there, but they're maybe, I won't say hush, but they're not as vocal as they once were, but they're still there. So
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to your neighbor? Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello, Stephen and Val. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. My name is Cesar Guedes. I retired a couple of years ago from the UN after 30 years of a long career in 4 continents. And well, I have seen Canada in action, as a provider of development assistance to many of the programs of the countries where I work. My last assignment was with UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So the security label is there. Of course, terrorism, illegal migration, counter narcotics, etc., cybercrime. And we could see in my last years, starting from Canada being the darling of the developed countries, how important it was for Canada to contribute bilaterally, as through CEDA, or multilaterally through the UN. And that's how I would picture what I experienced. It was an excellent partner. With good ideas, good advice, reasonable contributions, always forward and leading in the field. The Canadian voice was always extremely heard. And comparable, well, to the Nordics, well, a little bit with the Americans, but Canada was seen as independent and forward-looking and really sincere in the investment that they were doing. And this is really soft diplomacy, because that amount of money for development really opens humongous doors and also raises highly the name of Canada. And then everybody would say, yes, it's Canada, and everybody would take pride of that. Then I started to see how it started to decline, the level of monetary contributions, but a humongous increase of the level of reporting. So we had, for me, as a head of mission in the UN, it was one of the most dire tasks. Even I had to hire additional people to deal with our reporting, and sometimes it became even as expensive to pay for those additional staff than to execute the money that I was giving. No, so and many of this reporting came as well because of the pressure, the political pressure in Ottawa, the taxpayers, you know, the same, the dialogue that we are always listening. But also this reporting was fatiguing very much, you know, and there was not that much contribution. So on that front, I mean, gone are the days. I hope those days are back with more engagement, especially in these important areas that you mentioned, because with the lack of development support, development contributions, bilateral, multilaterally, it will bounce back as problems, in poverty, conflict, terrorism, radicalization, illegal migration that somehow will impact the own situation of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more from the room. Over here. Yes. Could you introduce yourself just very briefly, please?
Hello. Hi. Lynn again from NPSIA. Hi, Professor. Great discussion. My question is not so much a question, but more a comment, which is building on something that has been mentioned before, because I do feel like the backlash against, development and humanitarian engagement that's happening, maybe like not just in Canada, but in the States, it's probably because of the failure of the left or of these agencies to relate to the general population. I do feel like the Donald Trump, for example, or the rise of populist leaders, or the radicalization of some of the some of the youth towards more to the right, is because they're able to relate to a larger audience via platforms like social media, whereas institutions like the UN or of development development agencies, they're not able to properly communicate the impact of their work to the average Canadian, to the average person, which could be one of the reasons why we've been seeing kind of a decline in support for development. So so it's more like an observation about the disconnection between the work that these agencies are doing and what people are facing on the ground. And I feel like in this pivotal moment, as you mentioned, for us to have this conversation about how do we redefine development, maybe we need to find a way to relate the impact of development and humanitarian work to the everyday people, especially with the new generation. Well, I'm referring to Generation Z, for example, with climate change. Climate denial is no longer happening in its traditional form. Maybe in the States, people are still saying climate is not real, but it has reached a more sophisticated stage where the people who deny climate is not denying the existence of climate overall, but they're denying the man-made impact of climate change. So, and AI is another reason, is another example of like kind of the new threats that we are, now facing of the 21st century. So I do feel like developments have to face these new threats as compared to the older threats of the older world, which is, eliminating illiteracy or eliminating poverty. I'm not saying that poverty don't exist anymore, but we have approached like a new set of problems that the development agenda now have to address, and they have to also relate that to the average Canadian.
Thank you. I think you've actually helped us answer the question. Should I go first? You want to go first?
You go first. Yeah, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm going to be uncharacteristically short. In response to what Lisa has said, but is more widely reflected, this idea that, that there's been a loss of empathy empathy has become a bad word. We've seen kind of, the death of empathy, and that's a very real phenomenon. So this pragmatic approach of, this is what Canadians want, the Liberals should, or, just are, reflecting Canadians, the average Canadian's viewpoint in order to be elected or reelected. My approach to that is to be careful about being too pragmatic and about normalizing, because we're shifting the window of what's acceptable. And time again, when faced with right-wing and extreme right-wing challenges, mainstream parties, we've seen this all over Europe, adopt the vocabulary or sometimes positions of the right in hope of attracting voters from the extreme right, but it doesn't work. And what it does is it just shifts the whole debate in a way that is frankly dangerous. And what is needed instead is, rather than following Canadians, leading Canadians, convincing Canadians that they have a vision, that it's a good vision, and part of that goes through education.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent point, Stephen. And I think I think that politicians need to be the ones that are, in many ways, like you said, leading Canadians, but articulating that vision of why development and humanitarian engagement matters. I think that we need to be better at communicating, the academic community, practitioners, et cetera. We need to be better at communicating those results. And we also need to try and encourage those kinds of politicians to develop those narratives. I wanted to say two things. I think in terms of the pushback against development and humanitarian engagement, I taught last night and I gave my students a puzzle. And the puzzle was the following. Global health has been a tremendous success story, right? Lots of issues with some of the ways that, there's been vertical rather than horizontal health systems building, but we're seeing a shift towards more health system building, more sustainability. And you go to places like I partner with a university in Maputo, and the researchers there are just unbelievably top-notch. I learned so much from them. There's a real opportunity for co-learning. So global health, tremendous success story. We just lived through a pandemic. And that pandemic resulted in the confirmed deaths of 7 million people, but likely 18 million people died. Now we're cutting global health assistance. But make that make sense, right? How do you make that make sense? It must be that we haven't made the case strongly enough, continuously enough, and we need to somehow counter the narratives that development doesn't work, that the global south, that it's all neocolonialism. No, it's not all neocolonialism. And really engage in that. On the gender equality front, I use this metaphor of a bricks and mortar approach. So my slight criticism, I guess, of the FIAP would be that it was far too focused on advocacy. And in health, you need to marry kind of that advocacy with actual mechanisms of moving the needle on the ground, building those health clinics, doing those interventions so people see the tangible results and not just the kind of talking about gender equality. So those are my two.
All right, let's go for some more questions. We have one here.
I'm still trying to recover from the statement that we're in the middle of the death of empathy.
And then we'll have a question over here. And I did check online. There's nothing online. So go ahead.
Okay, awesome. I'll be really quick. My name is Muskan. I'm also an NPSIA student. The first question was, why do we look at development at a macro lens rather than a micro one? And my second question to that is, how can we communicate that development is beneficial and how impactful it is? I'll give a quick example of I spent 3 months in Ghana as a research and learning fellow with an incredible NGO, and it was very partnership, collaborative approach. And I had the opportunity to take part in a discussion in a room where they were working towards a grant writing, and it was not led by the NGO in Toronto. It was led fully by the partnered organization in Tamale. So yeah, I just want to reiterate those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have a question over here. And then a third one over here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Deborah Parks, and I'm a PhD candidate here. Again, it's not really a question, but it sort of follows on the death of empathy comment, I suppose, or the idea that we need to be connecting or communicating better, or that we need to be able to show that these developments in health, for example, are successful. And to me, I guess I just really feel that we have to begin by the language at the very grassroots. And maybe it sounds kind of simplistic, but I just find that, I mean, as everybody knows, our politicians, when I turn on the news, do not model in so much of their language, their accusatory, tones, and that other people matter at all, and that we should care about other people. And I mean, again, I mean, maybe it sounds simplistic, but to me, it seems foundational. And that if we're going to be talking about communication and empathy and being able to care about, health mattering to other people, that we have to treat people as though they matter. And that, so that's kind of my comment there. I just feel that that's so missing. And I just get so disheartened sometimes. I just kind of want to turn off the news. And so it seems to me, even in terms of communicating to, younger people, why should they care? Well, it's just really hard to listen to, so much negativity. And so maybe that's just one way that people turn off.
All right, thank you. And third question over here. I see you already have a microphone.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for the panel. On the topic of empathy and this feeling of people wanting to move away from development and how we can, get people more on board with international development, I think part of it connects to what we were talking about earlier today with wealth inequality, where it's framed as a zero-sum game of, well, if we as Canadians give money to and we fund international development, then that means that we're losing out on that money. And I do think that, there is a really big wealth inequality, and a lot of Canadians are struggling. I mean, we have a really high youth unemployment rate. Housing is extremely expensive. And I think it's not a real scarcity because we have such massive wealth inequality, but I think framing it in that way of saying, we do have the money to support Canadian. The money exists in the world to support Canadians and to fund international development, and really strengthening international tax cooperation and fair taxation of MNCs and high net worth individuals, I think can really help with, bringing people back into supporting international development, because I don't think that care has disappeared. I think the fact that we're all here today shows that that care hasn't disappeared. It's just we're all a lot of people are really struggling and feeling as though it's us versus them when that's not really the case.
Great. Thank you for the 3 questions and comments. Thank you to the 3 of you. Val, do you want to start this time?
Sure. I'll just make a couple of points. I think you talked about, thank you all for your questions. You talked about the us versus them. And I think that's the narrative that we're being fed. That's, if we think about the framing of things like housing and other challenges and the blaming of immigration for that, rather than blaming the people that didn't get the houses built. So I think that in a time of scarcity, watching what we say and how we say it, particularly for people that are in positions of power and influence, really matters. I think, again, one of the challenges with President Trump is that he has blown up a lot of these conventions of what you can and can't say. And it does have a contagion effect, and we've seen it impact on our politics. And this is why principles matter. So one of the things that I have been really struck by is how we're willing to see development assistance or humanitarian assistance be a pawn in a negotiation for a ceasefire in Gaza. These are principles that 10, 15, 20 years ago, I guess now I'm aging myself, 20 years ago, we fought back against that. And we really focused, I was working in foreign affairs at the time, really focused and put forward messages about the universality and the importance of those humanitarian principles. And it's really critically important that the policy leaders continue to do that. So I think that's, framing is really important. We need to go from scarcity to talking about why this is good for us and good for a peaceful society, and then just the critical importance of principles. I'm not sure if I addressed everything, but I'm sure you will. So I'll turn it over to you.
I'm not so sure, but let me see. I do have a few things to say in reverse order. So this idea of the trade-off, I mean, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so when Poilievre, before the last election, say, we're going to build this permanent naval base in Iqaluit, and to be able to pay for it, we're going to cut foreign aid. You don't need to do that. I mean, I'm not sure we need a permanent naval base in Iqaluit, and if we do, then we certainly should talk to some of the people who actually live there about it, which apparently they hadn't. But like, if we need it, we can build it. And we just increased our military budget by way more than that. And it looks like we're going to cut our foreign aid budget, but foreign aid is like this much compared to what we're just adding. And every time there's a crisis like COVID or after 9/11, for Afghanistan or whatever, we find the money if we want to. So it's not a question of we can't afford to do more, spend more on ODA. It's that we don't want to. And I mean, we should treat people as if they matter. The fact that we have to even say that is really shocking. And that's all I'm going to say in response to what you said. And then in response to your comment, so I'm just checking the time. Okay, so just very briefly, you invoked the difference between the macro and the micro, and I'm not sure this is totally what you meant, but you can look at development projects and say this one worked and this one helped people and this one enabled this and this one empowered, and you can show how many projects are actually quite successful. Some are not, but in a way that's okay because it's a risky business. It's like when you start a restaurant, like 1/3 of restaurants fail within the first year. Are we going to stop opening new restaurants? Of course not. It's often they're unstable environments, high risk, but the payoff can be really good. But anyway, so there is a lot of success at the micro level, but then people tend to look at the macro level and say, oh, but there's still poor countries and there's still war and whatever. So clearly foreign aid isn't working, and coming to that kind of conclusion. And I think what's helpful is what I said earlier, is the fact that we have just suddenly cut foreign aid by so much, and the negative effects, the devastation that has been caused by that in terms of, I mean, you mentioned LGBT communities, like how services have just been cut, public health, I mentioned HIV. That shows that foreign aid actually was doing so much good. So has it, solved poverty? No. Has it, eliminated hunger? No. But the world is a lot worse off without foreign aid. We just need to do it better. And some people say, okay, well, we don't need to spend more. We just need to spend better. And again, it's like, why the trade-off? Let's spend more and let's do a better job with that money. So on that,
can I say two things? Sorry,
yes,
because
yes, absolutely.
One of the messages I think to take away from this also is that we have this narrative of an existential crisis with the US and that Canada is facing this big threat. And the solutions are Europe, maybe Mexico if it's a good day, but we're not looking to other places as part of the solution to that. And I would argue that low and middle income countries and low income countries are a critical part of us being able to face this existential threat. And then the second point is somebody mentioned Minister Axworthy. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs during a really challenging time as well. And he was able to pursue his human security agenda in part because he wasn't the one that was focused on relations with the United States. So maybe there's a necessity within the Carney government to just have a few ministers on that file and allow the other ones to do their job and not to diminish that important work that needs to continue because they're always kind of focused on the US. So with that. And I just wanted to say that it's a pleasure to appear with you on a panel, Stephen. So thank you.
Well, I was about to say the same thing. I always appreciate learning from your wise words. So thank you very much. And back
can I
over
just-
to Ted.
Can I just take advantage of the fact that I have a microphone here and abuse that privilege? I want to talk about empathy just a little bit more because you noticed my shock there. I'm part of a project called the Peace Professionalism Project, and part of that is exploring what it takes to be professional in this field of peace. And so we've interviewed more than 85 leaders in peace work around the world and done a lot of other research. And in terms of values, one of the ones that comes to the top of the list all the time is empathy. So if that makes us feel a little better about leaving on that, there's others. There's over 20 others that people feel are necessary, but empathy, humility, love, things like this all come to the top of the list. So maybe that'll feel us that death ain't dead.
Good for you.